Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Ivory, and you are tuned in to the Embracing Neurodiversity podcast, where I share my personal journey of embracing and enhancing the experience of my amazing son who is on the spectrum. Through this journey, I've discovered a lot about myself and continue to grow every day. My goal is to provide you with some useful insights and stories that will inspire you in your own parenting journey. Thank you for tuning in. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Thank you for tuning in per usual. I want to dive right in because, as you all know, if you listen to the past two previous podcast episodes, we are reviewing the Conscious Parenting book by Dr. Shefali, and I am reviewing it through the lens of a mom who is raising a child on the autism spectrum. Though parenting is parenting, there are some fundamental differences, as I always say, when it comes to raising a child who thinks differently and who operates in the world differently, or perhaps the world operates with them differently. And so the idea, in my educated and experienced opinion, conscious parenting is essential when raising children. And it helps us as parents who are raising children whose differences show up more. We're all different, but when you're raising a child who's neurodiverse, their differences show up a little bit more overtly, which enhances their experience in society of being treated differently, which can enhance their ability to feel disdain for themselves, which is why the foundation from which they come, which is their home and their parenting experience, is important. I also appreciate this book because the reality is that this is a relational experience, and our children also are here to teach us and raise us to be higher versions of ourselves. And so the book speaks candidly about what that partnership looks like in the parent-child relationship. Last week, I touched on, I know that I'm jumping right in, but I want to mention, if you are listening to this podcast on YouTube, the video version, you are going to see me looking down a lot because I want to reference my notes. So I'm sorry that you'll see me looking down more than normal. However, going back to the recap from chapter 1 and 2, Dr. Shefali essentially opened up the book with discussing what conscious parenting actually means. She goes on to talk about how it is a parent-child relationship, and how children bring out the best versions of you, and how it's important to begin to do your own inner child parenting in order to be prepared to parent your child effectively. I recall in chapter 2 a story she told around a mom who was raising her child and had so many frustrations around who she imagined her child to be, and how her child was the opposite of that. And when the mom began to unpack her own work, she realized that in her own upbringing as a child, she was placed in a position where these expectations were placed upon her that were conditional. And as a result, she did not feel loved unless she accomplished things, right? And so, because she was operating in an unconscious state as a parent, she internalized those feelings and then began to act them out with her child. And so, when you're not conscious, essentially, is being aware. And when we're not aware, we are going to inevitably do what we have seen and experienced in our own lives and what we've been socialized to do. But also, if we're not aware of our own wounds, we will operate in a space of anxiety and project that upon our children. And so she highlights that a lot in chapter 2. This week, we're going to focus on chapter 3, and next week, chapter 4. And so I'm excited to dive into chapter 3 because this is when she talks about the importance of releasing our children from the need to get approval from us as parents, right? And obviously, this is poignant for us as parents raising neurodiverse children because more often than not, the way that they show up in the world is not going to be in alignment to what we've been socialized to think is acceptable. And we have to begin to be very aware of that as parents so that we're not imposing upon our children societal expectations. And therefore, not only are they looking for acceptance from the world around them, but also acceptance from us, right? And so I remember when I first started to read chapter 3 around the importance of releasing your child from the need of approval, I automatically thought, and I wrote it down, does my son Khalil seek approval from me? And if so, how am I cultivating that, right? Because my son is a confident child and he, of course, walks to the beat of his own drum and he seemingly does not seek approval from others. But when I really sat and thought about it, and then as I continued to read the text, which I'll highlight some things that came up for me, I did realize that my child, too, and all children, even children who are neurodiverse and on the spectrum, seek approval from their parents because it is human nature to want to feel loved and accepted conditionally. And that is what is embedded in approval, right? But when we begin to release our children from the idea of being approved by us, we allow them to love and accept themselves unconditionally so that they can teach others how to love and accept them unconditionally and so that they can love and accept others unconditionally, right? So we're going to talk about in a minute what that looks like in practice, but I want to read and highlight some things that stood out to me. Dr. Shefali writes, every child realizes that their behavior sometimes gets them into a pickle, but this isn't at all the same as not being accepted and respected for who they fundamentally are. So when we talk about releasing approval and accepting our child, we're not talking about accepting unsavory behaviors or looking past certain behaviors that are not in alignment to respecting themselves and respecting others. We're talking about accepting and approving them for who they fundamentally are. She goes on to write, this is why it's so crucial that as parents, we free ourselves from the illusion that it's our place to approve of our children. Who are we to judge them? They need to know that by simply being on this earth, they have a right to approval of who they intrinsically are. Just by the fact that they draw breath, they have the right to speak their mind, express their feelings, and embody their spirit. Such rights are bestowed with the birth certificate. I'm going to pause there because though in reading this, many of us may feel like, oh, of course, like, yes, when our children are born, they're born with these inalienable, quote unquote, rights of freedom of speech and expressing of feelings and being fundamentally who they are. But in reality, we live in a society where those three elements are challenged if they are not in alignment to what we have been taught is acceptable, right? And when we are not showing up in the way that social constructs have taught us to show up, we are judged, are ridiculed, are made to feel ashamed, and then we project it upon our children. But when we begin to embrace and understand the idea that because they come into this world with breath in their lungs, they have the right and autonomy to be exactly who they are, and we have no right to strip that of them, then we can begin to be present and celebrate the beauty in who they are, as opposed to spending so much time wanting to change certain things because it is in conflict to our own ego fantasy, right? And what I'm saying is not new. It's not new from the podcast. I've said this in different iterations, but I want to continue to remind us of that because it's very easy if we're not consciously practicing unpacking our own biases and our own socialization that we will be in friction with our children if how they behave and show up in the world is not in alignment to what we feel comfortable with. So I wrote a note in here just reading some of the script that stood out to me, something peaked for me. And I wrote that I am simply a vessel that brought Khalil into the world. Who he is or chooses to be is not for me to decide. Though they are our children and our role is to keep them safe, to keep them whole, to do no harm, we don't get to decide what their identity is and how they want to operate in the world. We teach them fundamental basics around love of self, love of people, respect of self, respect of people, structure, healthy practices. But fundamentally, when it comes to their purpose on this earth, it is not for the parent to decide that, right? Dr. Shefali goes on to write that on a grander scale, it isn't our place to approve or disapprove of whether our children are religious, gay, the marrying kind, ambitious, or manifest any number of other traits. While a child's behavior is subject to modification, that brings the child more closely in line with its essential being. Their core must be unconditionally celebrated. Our children need to grow up with the awareness that who they are is worthy of celebration. Even our children, right? Even our children, there is nothing fundamentally wrong with our children who are on the spectrum, who are neurodiverse in any other way, ADHD, dyslexia. There's nothing fundamentally wrong. They are different. Their brains are wired different. We want to live in a society that is amenable and adjustable and accepting of that, as opposed to focusing so much on our child changing who they are in order to fit in with a society that is fundamentally flawed, right? Dr. Foley goes on to say that no matter how it manifests, our children's essence is pure and loving. When we honor this essence, they trust we understand their internal world is good and worthy, regardless of what manifests externally. I really appreciate this, girl, because our children can feel how we feel about them, right? Sometimes, even when you don't speak your frustrations, it comes out in your energy, it comes out in your disconnect, your disengagement, right? And so, when your child feels that, that will manifest in their and show up in their behaviors. But on the other end, when your child feels that you fully accept and understand that at their essence they are pure and they are loving and who they are fundamentally should be celebrated, they feel that too, and they are more inclined to adjust to structures and systems that support healthy behaviors, right? They are less inclined to rebel because they understand now that they are in partnership with their parent and not in conflict, right? We don't want to be in conflict. We don't want to go in the opposite direction of our child. We want to be locked in step with our child. And Dr. Shefali writes in chapter 3 ways in which we can do that, primarily staying present. Whether you have an infant or a teen, your children need to feel that just because they exist, they delight you. Just because they exist, they delight you. That is so important. Your child needs to feel that even when it's not reciprocated, right? Like sometimes our children won't show us that they are grateful or that they feel safe or that they understand the value in your delight of them. And then sometimes they do show you that, and it's one of the best feelings in the world. But either way, they are deserving of that. We all are, right? And so the beauty of parenting is that perhaps if you weren't given the level of unconditional love and acknowledgement that you deserved as a child, you get the opportunity to redo that experience and give it to your child. And by doing that, it's inevitably healing you and your inner child as well. So, Dr. Shafali began to talk about how acceptance is key. And that was absolutely affirming for me because from the beginning of this podcast up until now, I have spoken about the most important piece of this journey of transforming as a parent and embracing your child is acceptance. Like, there's no other way around it. Like, we have to begin to accept our child exactly as they are. And I've said this, and the only way you can do that is by accepting yourself, right? And so she talks about this in the book. And I was saying this before I even read the book. And so I'm happy to know that my approach is also a common practice on other levels. And so Dr. Shefali writes, accepting our children in their as is states requires us to surrender our ideas of who they should be and enter into a state of pure communion with them so that we can respond to them as they need us to. For this to happen, all we need to do is yield to the ever shifting adventure of parenthood. Yielding to the ever shifting adventure of parenthood, going with the flow, as they say it, taking it day by day, as they say it, remaining grounded so that when change comes, when the shift happens, because it will, that the core of you doesn't shift, right? Parenting is absolutely an adventure that we must embrace as an adventure, and realizing that we celebrate the beautiful moments and we learn from the difficult ones. One of my favorite parts, our children will lead the way. This is why parenting a young child is our greatest opportunity for change. If we are open to it, our child acts as our guru. When we are present, when we are observant, when we listen to our children, they teach us so many valuable lessons. But you have to be open to it. You have to be on your own healing journey so that you are vulnerable enough and conscious enough to at least observe from a neutral state how your child is operating in the world, right? They teach us as much as we teach them, if not more, quite frankly. She goes on in chapter 3 to give some examples of parenting dynamics that have occurred in much of her practice with coaching parents and how she was able to help them navigate. She gives an example of a couple who has a child and how, because they historically had been high achieving people, it was difficult for them to accept that their child had learning differences, and that caused friction and shame. And instead of going inwardly to unpack why they were projecting a lot of their frustrations on their child, which kept them in this cyclical process with their child and themselves of frustration and disdain, right? Because again, when children begin to feel your frustration, they begin to act out even more. And so, in her work with this couple, Dr. Shefali challenged them to look at their own behaviors and to stop looking at their child's behavior as a personal affront to them. Because actually, when we look at our children's behaviors and personalize them, it's a distraction from the work that we need to do with ourselves. Until next time, I feel like this was a long one, but I'm going to break it up into two parts. So until next time, please take care of yourself. I'm going to link the book in the bio as well as other resources that I hope will be helpful to you on your journey as a parent of a child who is either on the spectrum or neurodiverse in any way. Take care of yourself.